Winston Churchill famously said, "Democracy is the worst form of government, except for all these other forms that have been tried from time to time." What he meant, of course, is that democracy is far from perfect, but it is the best system of government there is. If countries with democratically elected governments are generally richer and enjoy more freedom, why don't more countries adopt it? I'm David Wu, a former Wall Street investment strategist with a 20-year track record of making actionable predictions about major global change. Welcome to the Money Game, where I take on groupthink, propaganda, and conspiracy theories in my critical analysis of markets, economics, and politics. Before we begin, I invite you to subscribe to my free YouTube channel so that you will get a notification when a new video comes out. The world is engaged in a battle between democracy and authoritarianism, with most antagonists involved in major international conflicts right now on different sides of the political divide. Ukraine versus Russia, Taiwan versus China, Israel versus Iran, South Korea versus North Korea. It was not so long ago that everyone thought that democracy had already the final word. Yet, according to the Economist Intelligence Unit, only 8.4% of the world's population lived in a full democracy in 2021. Moreover, they reported a decline of the average global democracy score from 5.37 to 5.28, the biggest drop since the global financial crisis. Freedom House, a U.S. government-funded organization that conducts research and advocacy on democracy, says that democracy is in crisis. If this is so, how can we measure it? What does democracy in crisis mean for the global economy and financial markets? In 1992, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, American political scientist Francis Fukuyama published an influential book titled The End of History and the Last Man, in which he declared that the world has reached the end point of mankind's ideological evolution, the universalization of Western ideal liberal democracy as the final form of human government. What's happened that 30 years since the book came out, that democracy still has to justify itself to itself, or even fight for its survival? Apparently, democracy is not just a shirt that you can put on in the morning and then forget about it for the rest of the day. However rewarding, democracy is fragile, needing constant nurturing and care. The most important precondition for successful democracy is a shared commitment to the principles of democracy. A shared commitment that inspires trust. Trust that everyone else will play fair and abide by the rules. Trust that everyone else will respect the outcome of elections, including the losers. That's a lot of trust in people whom you never get to know in person. That level of trust is not natural. It doesn't exist in nature. Your dog trusts you, but it knows you are you. Bees trust each other, but they know they are on the same team. It is not an accident that 9 out of the top 10 countries in the global democracy ranking, that includes Finland, Norway, and Denmark, are small countries with relatively homogeneous populations. It is, of course, easier to trust other people when there are not too many of them and they're like you. The thriving of capitalist economies depends on economic growth. Economic growth, of course, requires private investment. Long-term investment needs policy stability. Policy stability needs political stability. If the biggest threat to economic growth long-term is political instability, then the biggest threat to political stability of democracies today is extreme political polarization. By political polarization, we mean the tendency for people to be divided by their politics. Polarization is not necessarily a bad thing in itself. At least in theory, it is just part of the process of politicization, increasing political awareness that leads to more political choices and institutional responsiveness. The problem for democracy is when political polarization becomes extreme, so extreme that it sows distrust. Distrust of people who don't share your politics, distrust of public institutions, distrust of the fairness of democratic process like elections. Extreme polarization has been attributed to the rise of identity politics in political discourse, greater ideological alignments with partisanship, and shrinking middle ground in politics. Whatever the reason is, it's reached a point that it should be a concern for everyone, whether you are a risk manager, an investor, or just a concerned citizen. To monitor this important trend, I've developed a polarization survey in partnership with Rewe, a leading online survey company based in Canada. This is a high-frequency survey that covers the G7 countries that include the US, Canada, Germany, France, Italy, the UK, and Japan. We first asked people to what extent their country is politically divided. 27% of Americans say that the US is extremely divided politically, with another 29% saying that it's very divided politically. France is a distant second, with 17% of the French saying that their country is extremely divided, even though another 34% of them describing their country as very divided politically. At the opposite end of the spectrum, just 12% of the Japanese and the Germans thought their country is extremely divided politically. We didn't ask people whether polarization will increase or decrease over the next 5 years. With the exception of Japan, the survey finds that in all other countries, more people believe it will increase than people who think it will decrease. The US once again stands out, with 17% of Americans who expect polarization will increase by a lot in the next 5 years. We didn't ask people whether the political stability of their country is threatened by the political division among its people. 45% of Americans answer extremely or very, compared to 38% of the French and 34% of the Germans. We didn't ask people whether they respect people who do not share their political beliefs in their countries. Here the results are similar across most countries, with most people reporting that they either respect or strongly respect people who don't share their politics. Interestingly, the US and France lead the other countries in terms of how many people who say they respect their political opponents, with 48% of the French and 41% of Americans who say that they either respect or strongly respect those people who don't share their politics. We didn't dive a little bit deeper by asking the respondents whether they like the people who don't share their politics. Still, across all the countries in our survey, more people say they like those who don't share their politics than those who say they don't like people who don't share their politics. But the subtle but extremely telling result is that fewer people say they like their political opponents than those who say they respect their political opponents. For example, just 22% of Germans said that they like their political opponents, compared to 42% of Germans who said they respect their political opponents. Just 20% of Italians say that they like their political opponents, compared to 46% of Italians who say they respect their political opponents. Now we get to trust, which I said earlier is the most important precondition for a successful democracy. Interestingly, in all the countries, more people said they don't trust their political opponents than those who said they don't respect or don't like their political opponents. 28% of Americans say they distrust or strongly distrust people who don't share their politics, followed by 24% of Germans and 23% of Japanese. You can respect a stranger or even like a stranger and not trust him and her. Yet democracy depends on trust. The trust deficit that the survey is finding gets to the root of the problem today. Polarization is about the disappearance of the center. When we ask people to describe their political belief, while 49% of Germans said that their view falls in the center, just 37% of the French said that they're in the center. As we said, extreme polarization causes political instability and thus policy instability. We find that just 15% of Americans don't expect any policy change after the next election, with 36% of them expecting substantial or immense changes. The UK is not too far behind, with just 19% of British say they don't expect any major changes after the next election. What these results tell us is that polarization is real and is expected to increase in the years to come for most developed economies. In the US especially, polarization has already reached a point that it is sapping trust in political opponents and seriously affecting political and policy instability. In that respect, we can say safely that the unrest on Capitol Hill on January 6, 2021 was not a fluke and reflects the growing underlying tension in the US democracy. It seems reasonable to assume that polarization will determine whether democracy will triumph over authoritarianism in the years to come. We will conduct these surveys regularly to monitor these trends. A further worsening of the polarization should be a serious concern for all. If you got something out of this program, I would really appreciate if you were to hit like and subscribe to my channel. If you want to learn more, especially about my investment strategy, please come visit me at davidwuunbound.com. Thank you for listening.